Welcome back to another episode of Right Here in Mass. Joining me today is Kim Borman, Executive Director of Boston Women's Workforce Council. Kim brings over 25 years of expertise in private sector management, marketing, and operations, and a wide variety of experience in building and sustaining nonprofit organizations. She's held senior executive positions at a variety of top Boston advertising agencies, as well as owned and managed her own agency. Kim, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Ashley. Glad to be here.
Yes, it's my pleasure to have you. Before we dive into talking more about yourself and everything that you've done in your career, I'd love if you could give an overview of what the Boston Women's Workforce Council is for those of our listeners who might not be familiar with it.
Sure. Believe it or not, the Boston Women's Workforce Council, or the BWWC, either of which is very easy to say, has been in existence for 10 years. It was started actually by Mayor Menino, and then extended by Mayor Welch, and then, of course, adopted by Mayor Wu. It is a private public entity that basically partners with the Boston mayor, whomever that may be, and greater Boston businesses to close gender and racial wage gaps. And one of the ways we do that is through measurement of basically demographics and compensation done by job category, or the wage gaps, if they still exist, at our member organizations. And we hope to show over time progress that is being made through different policies and interventions that we introduce to our members.
And I'd love to hear how you came into the organization. I know I had shared in your bio that you had owned an agency yourself and you had worked at a variety of other agencies. So could you share more of your story specifically of your career and what led you into this position today?
Well, I was always in advertising. I loved marketing. I got a graduate degree in that, many years ago. But I also always had sort of a hand in the nonprofit world, whether it be Planned Parenthood or whether it be Rian Immigrant Center. I was doing other things. And then as I sort of approached about 25 years in actual advertising in Boston, I decided I wanted to do something different. And I was lucky enough to be accepted at the Kennedy School. And there is where I sort of did this pivot to, okay, how can I work with nonprofits? And interestingly enough, how I work with nonprofits is I tend to do many of the same things that I did when starting my agency, is helping put together an infrastructure, helping to staff it, looking at budgets, finances, how do we bring in money? What are our services? Are they valuable to our members? So that was kind of, I found the Boston Women's Workforce Council in basically pretty much after I graduated, and I've been here since. So it's been about 4 years.
Oh, I love that. And so with that, what stood out to you about BWWC? Like, what was it about the organization that made you realize that this is really what you wanted to pursue in terms of your nonprofit career and advocacy career as well?
To be honest with you, having been in advertising, I had seen, and having been at senior levels where I actually saw the financials, there's always been a big gap in gender, wage gaps, and people of color. And there's not enough people of color in advertising to begin with. But in terms of women, there are many women, but they don't tend to get paid the same as men. And hopefully that has changed since I was there. Gosh, I guess it was 2014, so it was many years ago, but it was still pretty prevalent then. And so I wanted to do something about it. I don't think people do it on purpose. I just think it's something that happens over time, that women are not promoted at the same rate as men. And that's really what makes the wage gap persistent.
Yes, absolutely. And so with that, how is the BWWC empowering women and minorities of being able to kind of help close that wage gap or ensure that there's equal pay for them that they very much so deserve?
Well, interestingly, we work with the employers versus the employees.
Mm.
So employers join, they become members, and they take a pledge when they become members that one, they're going to do the math and they're going to see whether or not they have wage gaps. And oftentimes they say, oh, we don't have wage gaps because we've already looked. We've done an audit because it's been the law since 1963 that you have to equal pay for equal work. And in 2018, Massachusetts strengthened that law. And basically, there's a big fine if you can be proven that you are not paying people who are doing comparable work, comparable salaries. But as I said in the very beginning, that's not really what we think is causing the persistence of the gender wage gap. We think it has to do with not promoting at the same rate women, and particularly women of color. So how we help them is we help them first by saying, okay, do the math. Then once you've done the math, you need to dive in to see why you have gaps. And it could be different for every group. But by doing the math, and what part of that is giving us anonymously their information so that we can see a community snapshot, typically by industry, they can then compare their gaps against what the average is in the industry. We also put on quarterly, if not more, briefing sessions where we bring in researchers and practitioners who talk about, okay, what's working, and sometimes more importantly, what's not working to close gaps and bring diversity to the workforce. And finally, we make connections. We really, people like to talk to other people, and it doesn't necessarily have to be in the industry. We tend to see that things that work at a certain company will work somewhere else where the culture is very similar. So that may be the same industry, but maybe not. For instance, a few years back, Vertex, one of our larger members, won an award. We give out awards. They're called Wage Equity Impact Awards, and won an award for something they had done that really proved to close wage gaps. And I was called by someone that I knew at an advertising agency and say, I really want to talk to someone at Vertex because I think we could do the same thing, especially in our creative department. And so we put them together, and sure enough, they did. You know, they took their idea and they made it work for them.
I love that. And I love that you work directly with the employers who are looking to ensure that equality across the line, and also giving them those resources and research and connections to make sure that they're implementing it within their own organization for their employees.
I really think that, again, especially in Massachusetts, there's nobody who's discriminating on purpose. They just don't know until they look at their numbers. And that's where we start with everybody.
Absolutely. And you brought up a good point too about how a lot of it lies within women or minorities or people within minority groups not getting promoted. It's really just relating to that. So could you talk more about that and how you might, or how the BWWC might recommend some suggestions about how companies can get better at promoting internally?
Well, one of the major things that we found, and we did in a report in 2020, and we're updating it this year, that for basically national policies, we call them interventions in the jargon of our world, but policies and practices that have worked. And in terms of promotion, it means, first of all, keeping the criteria for promotion extremely objective. So this is where you see a difference where oftentimes promotions may seem like the criteria is objective, but the actual bonus that somebody gets for being promoted is based on very subjective criteria. So you have to keep everything that has to do with compensation very objective so people understand how they can get to the next level and how they can get paid more. The other thing is to have committees for promotion and decisions made by people that kind of are from either different groups, look different from each other. You know, you just want to make sure there is a diversity on the promotion committee. Otherwise, you're going to see the same people and the same types of people being promoted year after year. So those are the things that have worked. Now, to get people to promotion, there are certain programs that sometimes work. For instance, there's a difference between sponsorship and mentorship, which you've probably heard about before. Now, mentorship was key about 20 years ago, but mentorship tends to be telling you where the good restaurants are, or telling you sort of, you know, the culture in the place, which is important. But sponsorship, when you get somebody to sponsor, that means that they are willing to go out on a limb for you. So if a plum project comes up, they'll say, hey, let's put Kim on this because I think she can really do this, versus having managers just give the projects to whomever they're the most comfortable with. And that might not be the best way to get people promoted.
Yes, so that's a great point as well, giving them the opportunity to flex the incredible skills and expertise that they have with being able to just move up the ladder, ultimately get into those managerial and leadership positions.
Right. You have to have the experience. I mean, we're not expecting people to be promoted based on nothing, but
Right.
then you have to make sure that the experience opportunities are fairly balanced.
Absolutely. And with some of the members that the BWWC has, is there any public like case studies or really awesome examples in addition to the awards example that you had shared that you could talk about these incredible outcomes that have come from the BWWC and its members?
So we have about 200 plus. It goes up to about 250, depending upon who's being bought by whom and what day. But and they're all shapes and sizes. We have what we call anchor signers who are, they also are generous donors, but they have also been with us usually for many years. For instance, the State Streets of the World, Mass Mutual, Vertex. Arbella joined as a anchor sponsor about 4 years ago, and they are an incredible company in terms of when it comes to things that they do to make sure that people are promoted fairly. But to give you an example of an award we gave out in terms of, and we call them the Wage Equity Impact Awards, and we have companies apply for them because they get celebrated not only by all the members, but the press comes in and talks about these awards. One was from Mass General, a part of Mass General Brigham, which is one of our anchor signers too. And it was actually during COVID. And they had put together a program. It was led by the doctor who was head of like faculty development. And you may not be surprised by this, but doctors don't get promoted just because they save lives. They too have to have extracurricular things on their resumes. And one of those is, they call them grand tours or visiting doctorships. And they go either across the country to a different hospital, or they can go across the ocean to a different country. And they have to be there for about 6 months and lead rounds and, teach people about the kinds of work that they're doing. And they were seeing that they didn't have enough female physicians who were signing up or applying for the program. And the program was very important to then being promoted. So during COVID, there was sort of like, everything was grounded. I mean, nobody was going anywhere. They didn't want to stop the program, so they started it online. And you can do the same kinds of things online if you're creative that they were doing in person. And they encouraged women to apply this year, stressing that you're not going to have to leave your family to do this. And sure enough, they got about 30% more women to apply than they had in the past, and about 10% of them got promoted the very next year. Wow. So just with a little ingenuity and I guess it was a silver lining of the pandemic, they were able to put in place something that they've kept actually to this day. They had to get more funding for it, but now there is the opportunity to do grand rounds from an online standpoint.
Yes, and I think that's a wonderful outcome and case study to share. And you brought up a good point too about how motherhood comes into effect with this, because as you mentioned, when women couldn't leave their families for 6 months to go either overseas or across the country for these visiting rounds, of course, it made it hard for them to get promoted out of something that was out of their control or not necessarily fair. So I imagine that probably motherhood is something that you see a lot within the employees that you work with, just from women not getting promoted because of the fact that they're typically and historically the caretakers.
You're exactly right. And even though it's not labeled motherhood, everyone knows it is, because you can see the difference from the age of about 30 to 40 in terms of the promotion of women. And that's because women have to either stop for a while, work part-time, to take care of the family. And so, last year, Claudia Golden won an economist at Harvard, won the Nobel Prize for a lot of work that she has done about, she calls them greedy jobs, but it has to do with the idea of having to be putting in these hours, whether or not they're needed. And she's also looked at sort of the balance of work life and what's going on at your house, and are the partners actually dividing the work fairly, because that will always hold someone back. So you're very that's a really great question, because that is what is happening, is that during those periods of time, is that 10-year span is when we see that women are sort of losing the most of their sort of salary.
Yes, I can imagine. And it sounds, just from everything you've shared, that the work that you do is truly gratifying. I mean, when you talk about that example with Mass General and other members that you've worked with, like being able to actually see that data that comes out of it, I can imagine is a really great feeling, knowing that you're helping to support the promotion of and equal pay of groups that are very well deserving of it.
It is. Last year, 2023, when we did our last measurement cycle, we saw the gender wage gap go from 30 to 21 cents. So it was a 30% decrease. So that was really exciting. Unfortunately, we did not see the same with the racial wage gap, which was sort of all white employees and comparing their salaries against the average salary against all people of color. So that's something we still need to work on in Boston. And, there were reasons for both. One, what we saw, probably why the gender wage gap went down, is that we could see in our numbers there was a significant increase in the number of women who are in the C-suite. It went up about 3%, which brings the average salary then up. We also saw an overrepresentation of about 16% for people of color in jobs that really don't require any type of training. So there's not a lot of opportunity for promotion from those. So that's got to change. We've got to figure out how to make sure that our talent is getting trained and promoted in the way that should be.
I love that. I think you brought up so many good points that I love just like diving into. I mean, you just brought up the point of people being in positions where there isn't really room for growth or room for promotion. So are you partnering with other organizations to help people get in those like jobs that they can really use their skills and be on a promotional track? Or I'd love to hear more about that and kind of your thoughts on it.
Well, I'm going to go back to the example that I mentioned, but I didn't tell you what it was, from Vertex, because what they did and what they won an award for is they actually took the time to go through every job description they had and said, do we really need a bachelor's degree for all of these? Especially their tech assistants, where they had so many openings. They decided no, they didn't. They went to a group called Year Up, which you may be familiar with. They do training programs. They developed with them a curriculum for tech assistants that did not require four-year college degrees. From that group that were trained, they then hired people. Once they were at Vertex, those people could decide whether or not, as one of their perks, their benefits, they wanted to go back to school and get that paid for by Vertex. So that's sort of a road to promotion. It quite creative in a sense. Took some work, but there are ways to do it so that you can make sure that people at least have the chance and the opportunity to get more training and then get promoted, as opposed to just getting stuck and having nowhere else to go.
Absolutely. And I think that's such a smart idea to go back to all the job descriptions and see, is this level of higher education truly necessary for the job and its responsibilities? Or can we see where else people might have education, especially with so many more people pursuing technical schools and not going on from there? I mean, if they have the experience and the skills, why should they be disqualified because they didn't get a college degree?
Right. And I think when unemployment was so low, people were, very willing to sort of take a chance, shall I
Yeah.
say.
Absolutely. And it sounds like too, from employers being members with the BWWC, that it likely helps with both retention and then also hiring and recruiting as well. If potential candidates see that they're a member of the BWWC, it shows that they're putting in the work to remove that pay gap or make sure that women and people of color are being fairly promoted and giving the opportunity to do so. So I can imagine that helps with just talent and sourcing potential employees as well.
It's a really good point because, in fact, many people tell us on the side, the best thing about you all is you give me a little starburst that I can put on my career page that says I'm a part of the 100% talent pledge, and people ask them about it, and then
Yeah.
they get into a conversation. And what we found is that employers are not expecting employers to be perfect. They just want them to understand the issue and be paying attention to it.
Yeah.
And for so long, it was sort of like, oh, we don't have that problem here. No, probably you do have that problem, especially if there's turnover. And again, that it does help with recruiting and it helps with retention because
Yes.
people want the company to feel empathy towards that.
Exactly. And just as you mentioned, I mean, people don't, or the companies don't necessarily have to be perfect, but just showing that it's a priority for them and something that they're actively working towards, and not being like other companies or corporations that just might throw money at an organization or at a cause without actually doing the work. It shows that by being a member of BWWC, these employers are really doing the work to and kind of change the way that things are run within their company.
Right. And it's not easy because what we're
Mhm.
really talking about is changing culture. And that is,
Yes.
that takes many, many years. And it takes great leadership at the top to enforce it and pay attention to it.
Right, absolutely. And so with that, what's coming up for BWWC in the next like few months or next year? I'd love to hear if there's any exciting projects or any really cool initiatives that you're focusing on.
Well, one of the things that we're focusing on is that you may be aware that there was a wage transparency bill that was just passed in
Mhm.
July in Beacon Hill. And in many ways, we are the model for that legislation. So we are going to be watching and hopefully helping with the implementation of that bill because we um, know how to look at the data and we know how to analyze it. And we'd like to be statewide. We'd like this to be a statewide effort. Again, the wage transparency bill that was just passed does not include compensation yet. It will not until the federal government does. But still, the way you gather the data and the way you look at the data is very similar to how we do it.
Mhm.
So that is probably, the biggest initiative that we will be involved in 2024.
I love that. And for any employer that's listening to this episode who is realizing that they would like to become a member of BWWC, could you talk about how they could get started?
Oh, sure. Come to our website at thebwwc.org and fill out a form that says, "Are you interested?" And we'd be happy to tell you more and to talk you through it. It's pretty easy to join, and the more the merrier because the more people we have, the more data we have, the more valid our numbers. I mean, we cover close to almost 18% of the employees within
Wow.
the greater Boston area now. So um, our numbers are pretty projectable, but we'll take small, medium, large, anybody. So that's the best way to do it.
Love that. And employers listening might worry that maybe there's a huge lift required on their end for becoming a member or getting started. Could you talk about how the BWWC will kind of support them and ultimately hold their hand to not make it feel like it's, I don't want to necessarily say a burden, but something that would just be time intensive and pulling away from resources they might not have?
So most of the things are offered to them. If they want to come to an event, and some of the events are virtual, some are live, where there might be some uh, reluctance is in the sharing of the data, but
Mm,
we are really good about training people. And it's not, we've made it as easy a lift as possible. And the majority of employers already have to give this information in almost the same format to the federal government. We're just adding compensation to it. But we train live, we train by video, we train with documents, and we're always there through the whole process of input of data to answer questions, on a hotline. So it's really not as cumbersome as it sounds, and you're probably someone in your company's probably doing it anyway because they have to.
Yes, awesome. And within that, do you typically work with certain individuals within companies? Like, is there a certain, like, would it be HR, or maybe it depends who you work with?
It depends on how big the company is. The larger
Mm,
companies usually have someone that's called sort of like compensation and analyst, who does this for a living. Then otherwise it'll be someone in HR. But last time I did this, I won't give away the city because we do have towns and cities that are members too. I was on the phone with the head of HR for the city, like putting the numbers in. I mean, it's just whomever happens to have the task and the time to do it.
perfect. Good.
But over time, honestly, I think it's about 4 to 5 hours, like during, once every 2 years. It's really not,
Wow.
it's not that, it's not that time intensive.
Oh, so that's awesome to know that it's a very low requirement to make such a big impact.
Yes, right.
Awesome. Kim, as we get closer to the end of this episode, one of my favorite questions to ask our guests is what their favorite local businesses are to support. So, what would you say are your favorite places to frequent in the Boston area or even throughout Massachusetts?
Uh, I can think of two in my own town of Lexington. One is Revival Cafe, which is run by a young woman. She started actually La Crema, which was in Harvard Square, which was a very well established coffee and food cafe. And then I think that was closed, and then she opened other coffee cafes called Revival, and I believe there's 3 of them. And the other favorite, since my kids were very young, is Rankatori's, which is an ice cream store, which I think there's 3 of them now. But yeah, and he's been running them for years. So
I
those
love that.
are the ones I like.
Perfect. Kim, this has been such a great episode, and I've really appreciated having the opportunity to have you come on the show and share all of the powerful and impactful and meaningful work that the BWWC is doing. And now I'd love it if you could share with our listeners where they can find you online or find the BWWC online in case they'd like to connect and learn more.
Come to thebwwc.org. That's where we are.
Perfect. And I will link to that in the show notes. That way our listeners can click through and connect with you all from there. But thank you so much again for coming on today's show.
Thanks, Ashley. I appreciate it.